19. We used to do them, but then pandemic, so we went online for a while. We are absolutely delighted to be back, and we are very honored to have Allison Brent here as the first speaker of the new Ulysses Seminar talk. So a little bit about Dr. Brent. Most of you know her, but she has a degree in veterinary medicine, and she was already very involved in clinical veterinary, I can't say that word today, veterinary research before her daughter was born. Oh, sorry, please come in. No, okay. Before the diagnosis of her daughter, Quincy, changed the course of her life, really. She is now a fierce advocate. She's the Chief Scientific Officer of FAST, and she also co-founded GeneTech's Biotherapeutics, which focuses on developing an antisense oligonucleotide for Angelman. And it was recently acquired by Ultragenyx Pharmaceuticals. I'm really sorry, I'm fried today for some reason. Ulysses, a little bit about ourselves. Ulysses, our core values are patient centricity, social responsibility, and translational research. We enact them every day in our research and by getting involved with the communities beyond what is just necessary for the trials and for the studies. In particular, we believe that the relationship with the patient communities should be one of mutual trust and sharing, and it should involve a lot of listening. And we need to do what we can to help and to understand and to amplify voices from the community and facilitate access to research in any way we can. That means from disseminating the research findings, the research proposals, and getting feedback to actually facilitating access to the research studies for families that might find it hard to actually travel to the sites and so on. Patient centricity begins before the first stages of research. It begins with a planning. It should start with deciding what models and what tests should be worked on with the patients, even at the preclinical level, by talking to patients and caregivers and by understanding and listening what the lived experience is. And it continues permeating the research process through the end by getting feedback and by letting personal experience guide the research. Our core values lead us in a new journey against brain disorders, which puts the role of scientists, advocates, patients, and caregivers together at the helm. And it will bring forward, hopefully, the concept of discovering treatments, not just for the patients, but also with the patients. Allison here is a wonderful example of what it means to be at the crossroad between science, advocacy, and personal experience with a disorder. She has a unique insight because of the many hats she wears in the Angelman space, as a mother, as an advocate, and as a scientist. So thank you very much for being here, Allison, and
well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Ulysses, for inviting us to be here. It's really a great honor for FAST to be in Ireland and to be with our fellow Angelman families who have joined us today, which is really exciting. So thank you for being here in person, and all of you online, thank you for joining to really hear our story. And so I was asked to speak today about a parent's journey through drug development. And what's really important for me to start with is the fact the journey of incredible scientists, incredible work that's been done far before I was involved in this community. This is a journey of thousands of families that live this life every day. And I'm just going to share with you one example of this family to take you down the road of a day in my life and the day in the life of my daughter, and what our community did as a whole in order to advance the future and to bring transformative therapeutics to these children. And again, this is the journey of parents, not just this parent. I'm just one example. So my name is Allison Brent, And I am the Chief Science Officer for the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics. I'm also the co-director of the Angelman Syndrome Biomarker and Outcome Measure Consortium, which is a pre-competitive consortium that works with all industry partners in order to understand meaningfulness and validation of endpoints that are appropriate for clinical trials for those living with Angelman syndrome. And so we really work very hard to understand what endpoints are measurable and meaningful and what biomarkers are measurable that can really assess target engagement, which basically means can assess that a drug could be working in these children and adults living with Angelman syndrome. And so that's really an incredible initiative that the foundation started about 8 years ago. I'm also the co-director of another initiative called the International Angelman Syndrome Research Council, or InSync, and that's really a really collaborative effort of researchers around the world, both industry, regulatory, clinical, and basic science, working both in and outside of Angelman syndrome. So taking individuals that have done incredible work in other rare diseases and bringing them into the Angelman space so that we can learn from the advances of others and not just stay within the silo of Angelman syndrome. And so that's really how rare disease advances, is to learn from each other and to be able to share all of those learnings. And that's a really nice example of that type of consortia. And during the day, I'm a veterinarian. I'm a veterinary clinician. I run clinical trials in animals with naturally occurring diseases. I work in medical device development, which has nothing to do with genetics. But when my daughter Quincy was diagnosed at 5.5 months of age with Angelman syndrome, a lot of things changed for me, and this is where my life took a turn. And my most important job is that I'm the mother of that beautiful little girl, and that is Quincy. So in full disclosure, I am the co-founder and former chief operating officer of Genetics Biotherapeutics that was recently acquired in July by Ultragenyx. I'm a consultant for Ultragenyx as well. I'm a consultant and I advise other drug development initiatives for other rare diseases and other rare disease organizations. And I'm a member of the N of 1 Collaborative, which really focuses on ultra and nano rare diseases. So I'm going to take you through a journey, and I'm going to start with the patient journey, what it's like to really live a day in the life of a patient as well as a caregiver, because those sometimes are one and the same in neurodevelopmental disorders. And then I'm going to walk through the journey of a community member, because there's a lot that goes into growing a huge community that I jumped into that was already started well before my daughter was diagnosed, and the luckiest community I've ever been able to join for sure. And then I'm going to walk through the industry journey as a parent who walked through the caregiver and community journey. Entering the industry journey is also very different. And I've learned a lot through that. And then really what the focus is, the holistic journey, is taking all of those pieces and putting it together. And that's really how progress is made, is understanding all parts of it. So hopefully I can share with you a little piece of all of those aspects of what it's like to advance therapeutics for these children. a video that was made about our family, just for people to understand. I can talk about the genetics and I can talk about everything science, but if you live, don't cry. But when you see the child and the family and the impact that this type of disease has, it's a whole new understanding of what you're working for and why it's so important to meet the goals that you set for yourself for these kids. And so I just wanted you to feel what it's like to be a parent and to live with these beautiful children that have so many challenges, but also that you have a lot of strengths. And so that brings you to what happens when you're diagnosed with a disease like this. Well, you go through this odyssey of developmental delay and what does it mean and why. And it takes a long time to get answers. And when you finally get those answers, we were lucky, we got them at 6 months of age. I received a phone call by a neurologist, and I picked up the phone and I heard, Ms. Brent, I have catastrophic news for you. Those were the words. Your daughter has been diagnosed with Angelman Syndrome. And the first thing I said was, how do you spell that? Who ever heard of Angelman Syndrome? And whoever thought she had a syndrome? I have never been part of this world of rare disease. I didn't know what that meant. I've been part of a lot of other diseases, but not rare. And so I wrote it down, and unfortunately, I did what every parent should never do and type it into Google. And the first thing I clicked on, unfortunately, was Wikipedia, another thing a parent should never do, particularly not one that's involved in science. And I read all the things that Quincy will never be able to do. She will never walk. She will never talk. She will never live an independent life. She will likely have debilitating seizures. She will not sleep through the night for the rest of her life. And she will likely not go to college, have a career, have a partner in life, and have friends. Those are all the things you're thinking about in the first 30 seconds of this diagnosis. And all you can think to yourself is, how do I change that trajectory? So then I thought, well, I see all the things she won't be able to do, but what will she be able to do? And I learned it's not degenerative. So she will not die from Angelman syndrome, but she will certainly not live a typical life, and she will live a life of challenges. So knowing the prognosis for survival was great. The first thing I said was, then we need to fix this. How do I give this child the best life and advocate for what she's capable of? And how do I ensure she's accepted in this world that I don't even know how to be a part of? How do I help her? And it was super clear. I needed to be her advocate, and we needed to try to learn everything we could if we wanted to help with changing the trajectory that I was reading. So that was definitely clear. And then I went through this moment of probably within 2 hours, maybe an hour of her diagnosis of I can't do this. I didn't sign up for this. I don't want to do this. I didn't have children expecting that this was my life. I planned everything in my life. I planned college, vet school, my entire academic career. And suddenly, is my life going to change? Yeah, it sure is. And I didn't ask for that. So the next thing I said was I can't do it. And frankly, I don't want to. And then there's the guilt of what kind of mother are you? You're given this diagnosis, you just deal with it. And then it was well, how do we handle this as a family? How do we navigate this world of disability? How do we manage a life of therapy with a full-time job? I know you all know how I feel. And then really what came to me was there are solutions to most problems. We had to find a solution. That was my therapy of getting through this was, if there is not a solution to this problem, I can't get through it. Therefore, we must find a solution. Knowledge is power. And like I said in the video, my husband and I always have this motto that things are either possible or impossible, and there's no in between. And unless someone can tell me it's impossible, it's probably possible. So therefore, we're going to work really hard to figure that out. And I knew I had to be brave, and I knew we had to work smart. So that's really what we did. And I learned everything I could about Angelman syndrome. I had no idea there was a community at all. I thought we were alone in this world with this really crazy diagnosis. I went through all that in the first 2 hours of her diagnosis. And really what I learned was that Angelman syndrome is a monogenetic, non-degenerative disorder. It's random. I don't carry it. It's not inherited in me. It is just totally random. It's de novo. And it affects the 15th chromosome. And something that was really unique and exciting that was very important to understand was that there's this really unique genetic process called imprinting. And that's what causes Angelman syndrome. And ultimately, there's a maternal and a paternal allele. So there's 2 copies of every chromosome, one from mom and one from dad. And the one from dad is working and the one from mom isn't. And in our entire body, that's fine. You only need 1 copy. But unfortunately, in the brain, there's a phenomenon called imprinting. And so what that means is that there's this long piece of RNA called a long non-coding RNA, or the UBE3 antisense transcript. And that transcript is inhibiting the expression or the transcription elongation, so the full transcription of the UBE3 gene on the paternal copy of the gene, on the father's copy. And that's fine. All of us have that. So we all are functioning neurologically relatively well. But what happens in Angelman syndrome is that we're all silenced on the paternal, but they're also not functioning on the maternal. And so it's either deleted or it's mutated, but ultimately the gene on the maternal is not working. And that's fine for the rest of the body. So peripherally, these kids are totally normal. But what happens in neurons is that they are null. They have no functioning UBE3A generally. And because of that, that results in some pretty dramatic symptoms. And if you think about the 20,000+ genes in the genome, this single gene is a real bugger because it causes a lot of challenges. And so that's what the symptoms are of Angelman syndrome, is really what happens when you're missing that single gene is that there's a universal lack of speech. Most kids with Angelman syndrome don't ever speak a single word in their whole life. They have life-threatening and debilitating seizures. They have very severe developmental delay, poor motor skills. They're incoordinated, poor gross motor and fine motor. They have this very unique happy behavior, as you saw with Quincy. They giggle, they laugh, they love. They're social as can be, generally. They're incredibly happy children. And some kids sleep 2 or 3 hours a night, every night for their whole life. Imagine the impact that that has on a family or on caregivers. They're unable to live independently, regardless of their genotype, unable to live independently. Some can have really severe feeding issues where they actually have feeding tubes because they can't actually eat independently, and they can't swallow well. They have dysphagia. And there's clearly a significant unmet need and no approved drugs for the disorder. And so what I read within the first day or so of her diagnosis changed everything for me. And what was really important to read was this very strong hypothesis to support human translation, in that you don't need to fix every neuron to have a dramatic impact on the course of the disease. And so there's this paper on Mosaicism, which means that some cells in the body express UBE3A and some cells don't. And that means some brain cells express it on the maternal and some brain cells don't. And when that happens, there's a paper that looked back at these individuals that are diagnosed with Mosaicism, and it's a very small portion of our population, 1% to 2%. But they did a study looking at those kids, and what they found, as you can see here in the image on the left, is that if you can have 1% mosaicism, meaning 99% of your neurons are not expressing UBE3A, but 1% of them are, or you can have 40% mosaicism, where 40% are expressing UBE3A and 60% are not. And then there's no diagnosis of mosaicism above 40%. The next diagnosis is typical. So what does that mean to me? A couple things. One is that you only need 40% or more in order to be neurotypical. And the other means to me that if we look at the clinical severity of disease based off of the mosaicism patients, when you have 1% to 5% expression, these are kids that have few to no seizures, are ambulatory, may have some balance issues, and have speech. If you have 20% UBE3A, you have no seizures, you're fully ambulatory, and you can speak in sentences. And if you have over 40%, there's no evidence of a neurologic disorder according to what's published in the literature. Now, maybe there's some subtle learning disability that never resulted in genetic testing, but you meet one of our kids, you're going to recommend genetic testing. So if you're not genetically testing individuals over 40%, it's probably pretty subtle. And that is a different child than I live with. 1% is a different child than I live with, and I think a different child than you live as well. And so what does that mean? That means that you don't need to fix every neuron. You just need a little bit, and that could go a long way. And the enemy of good is better. We need to get somewhere and perfect it down the road, but we need to make progress getting in that direction. So when people talk about, well, you don't get a lot of transduction with gene therapy into the brain, you may get 1% to 5%. I'll take it because that is a different child than I live with. And if I could be on that clinical scale at the bottom of it, I could tell you that my daughter falls off the cliff on the left of it because she has absolutely no UBE3 that she's expressing in her brain. And so for me, this changed everything to realize what are the possibilities for these kiddos. And so then I had to really think about, as a clinician, how do we address this clinically? And so I read every paper I could. This is the first week of her diagnosis now. It sounds like an eternity, but it's been a week. And I called every senior author I could on every publication. I attended every scientific conference that I could. And really what was so clear to me was that so much work was being done in Angelman syndrome. I was so impressed with how much funding there was in Angelman syndrome, that there were foundations that were funding, that NIH was funding, different companies were starting to look at Angelman syndrome. It was very clear a lot of money went into it, and there was incredible science. So I felt really lucky that we had a starting place. But what I realized as well was that it was a really great decade to be a mouse with Angelman syndrome. But unfortunately, it wasn't the right decade to be a human with Angelman syndrome. And I didn't really care about the mouse. I kind of cared about my kid. And so I really wanted to ensure that we can translate from the mouse into humans as quickly as possible. And as a clinical trialist, that's what I did. I take proof of concept and I put it into patients with the ultimate translation to the pediatric human population. That's what my medical device background is in, is really helping kids through the use in animals with naturally occurring diseases. And so I felt like if I can help in any way this community, maybe I can leverage my translational research background and I could be helpful. So I called everybody. And the scientific advancements were obviously so incredible, and translational science just hadn't taken that leap yet that it needed, because it was a little early and they were working really strongly in the lab, but that they weren't ready for that leap. And so I really felt that it was the right time, if I could be helpful, that maybe I can help with that. And so I couldn't really wait for a treatment. I really wanted to help shepherd one, and I needed to behave like a clinician in order to do that. And so really the next best thing that happened was I asked a lot of questions at a scientific conference, and I think a lot of the researchers were like, who is this lunatic, asking us questions about our research, but I really needed to understand why it wasn't leaving their lab. And then what I realized was they were trying to get it to leave their lab, but there really weren't pharmaceutical companies that were very interested. So what if we left it with them and we helped bring it out of their lab and then got the pharmaceutical companies interested? And so I asked those types of questions to all the researchers that I could find. And then in 2015, right after that conference, I was lucky enough to be asked to join the board of directors of the largest non-governmental research funding foundation in the world for Angelman syndrome, called FAST. And so I was really so lucky and honored to be asked to join the team and see what I could do with my skill set if I could help them in any way. And I wasn't sure kind of where things were at and what I could do, but I wanted to help. And it was super clear. They had an amazing team. They had already been trying to figure this out. They've been really working hard to get the basic scientists and the neuroscientists to translate and to really get into early clinical trials of repurposed drugs and things like that. So the infrastructure was great and it was there. And they had this consortium of scientists working together in different academic institutions, getting out of their own silos and collaborating. And so once I dove into understanding what this foundation had done and what they were doing, I was so impressed. And I felt like I can maybe help the team as well, and I can maybe move things along in a way that I understood, and I can really help them. And so as we considered all of the different therapeutic strategies and really thinking about what we needed to get to that next era, I was tasked with creating a roadmap to a cure, and tasked with creating this roadmap to say, how do we get out of the lab and how do we get into humans? And really the key to jump through that valley of death is to get to a human candidate and get out of a mouse candidate. So we worked with our entire scientific team, put budgets together and said, what is this going to cost? You need an ask. You need to know what you're asking for. You can't just be raising money to cure Angelman syndrome if you don't have an ask. And so we created an ask. We created a very clear scientific plan to get you a human candidate for six different disease-modifying therapies for Angelman syndrome. And so when we realized we need different approaches to address different parts of the population, there's different genotypes and there are different ages, and there's a lot of different global influences. We wanted to ensure we didn't put all our money in one basket and that we were spreading out whatever it was so that we can see what's best for humans, not just what's best for a mouse. And so we really created this roadmap to a cure, and we developed this ask. And the ask was more money than we had ever considered we would need, which was $5.8 million. And that ask was just to get from mouse candidates for 6 therapeutic platforms to a human candidate. It wasn't getting through IND enabling studies or the regulatory agencies. It was not de-risking it from a toxicology or pharmacology perspective. It was not getting into a clinical trial. It was getting to human candidates. But you needed baby steps, right? And we didn't have human candidates at this point. So we said our ask, our roadmap to a cure 1.0 is to get a human candidate for 6 therapeutic platforms. And that was in 2016 with a $5.8 million ask. And then we had the most amazing lunch of our lives. And one of the parents of a child with Angelman Syndrome who lives in the UK came to New York and we had lunch. And he asked me, what's our plan to cure Angelman Syndrome? And we had just kind of come up with this whole plan. It was back of a napkin and it wasn't ready for prime time. And I wrote it out and I explained to him exactly what we were proposing and our scientific team had proposed. And the cost was $5.8 million. And fast forward just a few months, him and his family foundation gave us a check for $5.8 million. So we raised $5.8 million in 6 weeks of our ask, which is incredible. And it accelerated everything thanks to this incredible family. And so that's really where things just took off from all the great work that had been done before. And so we committed to this family that we would do this in 24 months. And that's exactly what we did. And within about 6 months, there was an incredible discovery with one of the therapeutic platforms, which was an antisense oligonucleotide. And so really, as you can see, the vision of the foundation was really to take this entire volunteer board of directors, which are families and caregivers, and bring transformative treatments to all individuals around the world, regardless of their age or their genotype, to eventually cure Angelman syndrome, which really for us is to create transformative therapeutics for these kiddos, regardless of where they come from, what their age is, or what their genotype is, and do that in the most collaborative way that expedites the process. And that is really the mission of the foundation. And so our funding philosophy is to cure AF. But what does cure mean? Okay, it means many different things to different people. So, we really break it down into CURE, which is collaborate, understand, ready, and expedite. And so for us, we need to collaborate with the best minds in the world and get out of our silos. We need to understand what it takes to do this and really understand different therapeutic platforms and how that could impact Angelman syndrome. We need to ready and establish endpoints and establish biomarkers in order to make sure when we get to clinical trials, we have the right models. We have stem cell and organoid models, that we have the mouse, the rat, the pig. We have 7 rat mouse models, that we have all the right models of all the different genotypes, and that we expedite. We're ready to move. We're not waiting for someone else to do it, but we're ready to do it ourselves. And that really is the vision and really the mission of the foundation. And so when we create this roadmap to success, we needed to investigate all of the different strategies. So one is gene replacement therapy. Let's give them back in their neurons the UBE3A gene. That's what they're missing. Well, that's pretty easy, not easy. The other way is that what if we just activate the silent copy? We talked about that imprint. Well, what if we inhibit the stop and activate the silent copy of the gene? So that's paternal gene activation. What if we just understand that this is a synaptopathy, so ultimately the communication between the 2 neurons is really abnormal? And what if we just use drugs that are downstream that can improve the communication and the coordination between those 2 neurons? That could be very helpful for these kids. And we need to prepare. We need to be ready for clinical trials. So we need to create models. We need to have endpoints. We need to have biomarkers. We need to understand the best clinical trial designs and make sure that it's applicable for all genotypes and all ages. And so in March 2016, as part of this initiative, we also launched the Biomarker and Outcome Measure Consortium that we talked about earlier. And in 2016, there were 2 pharmaceutical companies at the table. And then 2 years later, there were 7. And today there are over 30. And so all of that, why? Is because I believe strongly our community leveraged everything we have to be the low-hanging fruit for so many pharmaceutical companies, that we make it so easy for them and we make it so clear that we are a targetable disease that people want to work on it. And it doesn't hurt that there's some positive clinical data out there. But this is well before there was any positive clinical data. We got people to understand the biology, make it very clear that it's targetable, and make it clear that we can get therapeutics to the problem, which is to the neurons. And so we worked really hard to do that. We needed to understand what's most meaningful to parents and caregivers. What matters to us? Just because they have a neurologic disorder, what if we're happy with neurodiversity and we're okay with our kids not speaking, seizing, and not sleeping? Then no one's going to approve a drug that fixes something we don't care about, right? So what matters to us? And clearly, what matters are all the things I said, in describing my daughter. What matters the most is the fact that they can't speak, that they can't communicate, that they have a very hard time expressing themselves, even though they understand so much. But if they can't express themselves, then you cannot understand their cognition. They cannot tell you how they feel, what hurts, and how to live the best life possible. So there's no question when we do surveys and disease concept models, and we've done this, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars understanding this, communication is the number one thing for Angelman syndrome and for most neurodevelopmental disorders in individuals that have communication compromise. Second is seizures, and third is gait. That our kids need to be mobile, they need to walk, and they need to be able to walk safely so that they can be as independent as possible. And so really understanding all of those things, and then how do we measure them? How do we measure them in a way that's meaningful and that's measurable? And if we can't do that, then whatever we develop, whatever drug we develop, it doesn't matter because it can't get approved and then it can't get to patients. And so we created really understanding the priority of these functional domains. So communication's number one, motor, globally understanding the clinical symptoms of the disorder, understanding activities of daily living and quality of life, very important, cognition, sleep, seizures. And then of course, biomarkers. Can we measure change objectively, like with an EEG or with measuring proteins in the CSF or in the blood? And that really, really matters. And so we looked at all of the measures that are out there for neurodevelopmental disorders, all of the measures that have been measured in Angelman syndrome in a 15-year natural history study, and then looked at those measures to say what are measurable, what are meaningful, and what shows change over time, what has the capacity to show change over time. And in doing that, we were able to kind of bring it down to priority measures for Angelman syndrome. And we've spent a ton of time and effort really figuring that out. From communication, we developed our own communication endpoint for seizures, for gross and fine motor, for cognition, for activities of daily living, for sleep, and for behavior. All of the things that matter to families. And these are endpoints that can be measured and can show meaningful change. And that's what's really, really important when you think about endpoints. And then I think I said earlier, within that 24-month period where we committed to this family that we were going to have human candidates, within the first 6 months, we had an incredible discovery out of a lab at Texas A&M University. And that was the discovery of a human antisense oligonucleotide. And really, in neurons, in Angelman syndrome neurons, what was discovered was that we were able to knock down the antisense transcript, or the stop, and we were able to turn on the father's copy of the UBE3A gene. So if you see here, the blue line going down, that's knocking down the antisense transcript. And at the same time, the red line going up is activating the father's copy of the gene. And so what that showed us was that in neurons, this drug could knock it down and activate. Now we had to say, this is an incredible discovery. And there, a couple of years prior to that, an incredible discovery happened at a Baylor College of Medicine in Art Burdett's lab. And what they discovered was using a mouse antisense oligonucleotide that you can rescue some of the symptoms of Angelman syndrome in the adult mouse model by giving an intrathecal or a brain, in the fluid of the brain, in the CSF, a delivery of an antisense oligo that was specific to the sequence of the mouse. And you could rescue things like contextual fear conditioning and waking. And so ultimately, what we showed was that target engagement is possible. Proof of concept is there that this drug can make a difference in these animals. And ultimately, if you look at the brain of these mice, at the top is what it looks like staining for UBE3A in a mouse model. You see no red. And at the bottom, what it looks like after an antisense oligo when you activate the paternal gene. The entire brain is red. It's activating the father's copy of the gene everywhere. And so that tells us that there's some proof of concept and target engagement there. And we have a human candidate that could do something potentially similar, but we only have data in neurons. So we decided at that point that we wanted to do something that would advance the next step from human candidate and get that toward human trials and de-risk it a little bit further. And in order to do that, it's incredibly expensive. And so we decided, rather than putting all of the money of the foundation into taking it to that next level, IND enabling studies, which basically is required by the regulatory authorities in order to get to a clinical trial, we needed to think about how we can invest into that, but bring in outside funding in order to fund that, while we continue to fund all of the other things that we have committed to. Remember the 6 disease platforms, this is only one. We have 5 others to go. We will never put all our eggs in a single basket. We don't know what's going to work in these kiddos. And so we decided to start a company. And we started a company called Genetics Biotherapeutics. And I became the chief operating officer of genetics. And we advanced that program into a phase 1/2 clinical trial. And so we launched that company in 2017. And we brought together, of course, the inventors at Texas A&M University, some angel investors, and the foundation. And we created a for-profit company out of a nonprofit. And we were singularly focused just on an antisense oligo for Angelman in order to get that into a phase 1/2 clinical trial. That was our ultimate goal. And we brought together a team of world-renowned experts in order to help us do this and ensure that we really had the best team at the table that had a ton of experience in oligos. And so we brought everybody together, and we ultimately wound up, once we had some data that looked really good in non-human primates, we ultimately wound up partnering that program with Ultragenyx Pharmaceuticals. And then they helped the company launch a phase 1/2 clinical trial in 2020. And then they just acquired the company in 2022. And so now that program is under the, under the realm of Ultragenyx. And so that was obviously an incredible feat for the foundation, for the community, for the founders, and for everybody that was involved, that they believed in this program as much as we did. And so when people think about this journey, it's a lot. It's a lot of different pieces that kind of merge together. And everyone asks me, what's the best perspective to have? The parent, the caregiver, the clinician, like, what's the best perspective? And it's a confluence of all of it, really, because the best perspective is to understand all pieces and understand all stakeholders. And I'm so lucky that I've been able to be exposed to all those pieces, because I feel like I can speak the best on behalf of our patients when I understand what different stakeholders need. And so it is that personal connection, I think, of our entire foundation and our entire community that just makes such a huge difference. And I want to emphasize, it's the vision of the entire community that has made this possible for this disease. And we're working so hard to advance numerous programs in parallel, not just one, because there could be over 500,000 kids in the world living with Angelman syndrome. And so it's really important that we understand that we're working for all of those kids and not just one child. So when you ask for my story, ultimately it's the story of all of us. And so we work for all of them. So basically, just to kind of keep in mind that in drug development, for every 15,000 drugs explored, 5,000 make it through IND enabling studies through the regulatory agencies, 10 get into the clinic, and only 1 ever gets approved. So should we stop at 1? Because we don't know if this is actually going to be the answer for our children. We cannot. We certainly cannot. And so in 2013, this collaborative discovery team was launched from FAST, well before my time, and we're so grateful for that incredible team. And they've allowed us to jump to that next level of creating this infrastructure where we can test tons of compounds with experts in neurobehavior that can evaluate the value of different drugs and compounds in this disease model. And then moving to accelerate all of these proof of concepts from human candidate into the clinic. So really becoming an accelerator is what the foundation is all about. How do we get from discovery to the patients? And that's really where we are today. And so when my daughter was diagnosed 7 years ago, I was lucky enough that there were pharmaceutical companies and academics that were working on Angelman syndrome. And so this is really what that roadmap looked like. We had some basic research, some drug discovery, and some preclinical work. And there were about 5 programs that were in discovery. And then 2 years ago, this is where we were. And unfortunately, we had our first phase 3 clinical trial failure with a company, Ovid Therapeutics, that was working on a downstream target for Angelman syndrome. And there were 21 pharmas working in Angelman syndrome. And this is where we are today, with over 30 programs working on Angelman syndrome. And so ultimately, why is everyone interested in Angelman syndrome? And it's probably because it's targetable, and we've done a lot of work to make their lives easier in order to be able to test their drugs in Angelman and be able to get into a clinical trial where we've given them endpoints and we've given them trial design, and we've really created ourselves to be the low-hanging fruit, which was exactly what the foundation set out to do. And so what is also important to realize is all of those flags are robustly, if not fully, funded by the foundation. And so we put a tremendous amount of money. So we've spent over $30 million in research for Angelman syndrome. And we know that it takes about $20 million to get into a phase 1/2 and through that early stage. It is very expensive to develop drugs. And so we need to keep going in order to make sure that we never let these arrows stop unless there are no-go decision and the drug doesn't work. But we can't just let it stop because of reprioritizing. And so I said that we had a failure in a phase 3, and we've had another company pull out, and then 2 other companies get paused just in the last 6 months. there are tumultuous financial times. There's not, when the markets are not great, we can't rely on biotech to make Angelman their priority. They're going to have other programs that are farther ahead. They're going to have other, shareholders that are going to reprioritize what's important to them, and rare disease just might not be it, or gene therapy might not be it, or Angelman syndrome just might not be it. But if the foundation stays involved and the foundation holds as long as they can while advancing it, we know that we will always be our priority. And that's incredibly, incredibly important. What's also important to realize is that drug development of just the therapeutic is one thing, but what about all the other things it takes to get there? So at the same time, we have to think about animal models, regulatory needs, natural history studies, endpoint development, regulatory engagement, policy, newborn screening efforts, diagnostic efforts. Where are all the kids around the world? Where do we need to ensure we get treatments to those parts of the world? So when 6 years ago, kind of this is where we were with all of the other discovery efforts. And today, this is where we are. So we're moving all of it forward, but it is a huge parallel effort that our entire community is just jumping in and helping incredibly. And so we're very grateful for that. And that's where we stand now. So this holistic journey has brought together so much in the way of pharma, biotech, academics, foundations to really help advance all of these programs, whether it's gene replacement therapy, protein replacement therapy, hematopoietic stem cell gene therapy, whether it's paternal activation using ASOs or artificial transcription factors or CRISPR, shRNA, miRNA, we're heavily invested in all of them. And then, of course, downstream targets, symptomatic therapy can make a big difference potentially. So we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. We don't know what's going to work for what individual. But again, we have to remember that we can't rely on other people to make us their priority. And so numerous potential therapeutic platforms have been invested, of course, different targets, different genotypes, different ages. AS is very unique. We do have some promising clinical results to date, which is getting a lot more people interested in Angelman. And we are focused to identify gaps and accelerate all shots on goal wherever and whenever we can. And we as a foundation have to prioritize that because we don't know what's going to work the best for our kids. And it might be a combination of therapies. So really, drug development is definitely hard. I can assure you, as can these mamas here, living with Angelman syndrome is far harder. And I've seen both sides now. Living with this disease is much harder than drug development. FAST works really hard to accelerate and de-risk as many programs as we can. And really, we rely heavily on other parties to make our disorder a priority. When times are tough, their priorities are going to change. And so we really need to make sure that the priorities for FAST and the entire Angelman community will only change when our tagline changes. And it's not going to change before then. So if our tagline is Cure Angelman, it's not changing until we can change that tagline. And I hope that's soon. But until it happens, we're going to keep focusing on being the priority for as many programs as we can. And so we're trying to find every child in the world living with Angelman syndrome. We launched this initiative called FAST Global Search and Rescue, which is to find every individual around the world, whether they're undiagnosed, misdiagnosed, or they're just not connected. Because not only are trials available for these kids, but more than anything, an amazing community is waiting for them to embrace them and let them know the future for their child is really, really bright. And if you're not living with that hope, it's really hard to live with any rare disease. So we're so lucky that our community has so much hope. And so anybody watching, certainly join the search and rescue. You register your kid. It's de-identified information, but we know that there is a child with this age and this genotype in this country. And then we can try to push different entities to work in those countries because drug approvals are going to be country by country. They're not going to be global without us working really hard to make it that way. So we need to know where people are. So please join if you're watching. And so Quincy is my reason to fight every day to accelerate, but every one of our families have their own reason. And I'm just the spokesperson today for my reason. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Alison. That was an excellent talk, as usual. Definitely, you're saying don't cry at the start. The first time I saw you speak was at, I think, the Neurodevelopmental conference online, and I sat at my kitchen table sobbing. So I held myself this time. No need to be sorry. And that whole point is to actually let people know what these experiences are like and to share these experiences, and so that we can be inspired. Like, I mean, we're not directly affected in Ulysses by Angelman, but our empathy is to is there in order to go, well, hang on, we're not, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't fight for it, along with the other disorders that we fight with. So it is really inspiring to see, not only did you say, I'm not resigned to this fate, I'm not going to do nothing, I'm going to do something. You did an incredible amount of work, and it's obvious there of how much you've done. Those graphs at the end really show the progressions now that are happening. Like, and I know it's a team effort, and but it is so impressive, especially in the rare disease space, where, as we see, the drug companies can be whimsical. They can say, well, actually, no, we're not doing that. We're going into something else, and you've lost it, and that could set back research by decades. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to say thank you again. I'm going to open the floor to questions. Does anybody have anything they'd like to ask? I'm going to ask. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Hey, how are you? It was a really interesting presentation. I didn't know about this rare disease, and I wanted to ask you if you know the prevalence of this disease in Latin America. Maybe if you work with
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, do we know the prevalence of the disease in Latin America? So we have 7 FAST global organizations, one of which is FAST LATAM, FAST Latin America. And so they're working to understand the prevalence there. We believe the prevalence is the same around the world. So there's been studies done in Europe, Northern Europe, Asia, Australia, United States, and it's generally around 1 in 15,000. It does not seem to be different in different regions of the world. It's just that in Latin America, there's not easy genetic diagnosis. And so they are underrepresented because they're not diagnosed, but there's a huge effort by FAST Latin America to improve the diagnosis odyssey, and they're part of the Search and Rescue Initiative. And they're paying for individuals to basically be diagnosed in order to find them. But they have hundreds of individuals in Latin America that are part of the organization. That are identified and certainly involved and very active. So it's a wonderful community and a wonderful organization.
Yeah.
As kind of a follow-on from that question, you mentioned about how you're being proactive in thinking about how do you get into these different countries. It's going to be a country-by-country approval. Beyond just even the approval, how do you make sure these treatments do end up getting to these families? Like, I mean, it's not going to be cheap. These treatments are not going to be the equivalent of going in and buying paracetamol. They're going to be expensive. So have you had any ideas how to kind of make that more available for people who might not be able to afford it, or they might not have a health system that supports these kind of treatments?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and it's a hard question. So we know that ultimately the foundation will never commercialize a drug. So the foundation will never ultimately make that decision. But what we also can work on, and what we actively work on in the different FAST organizations around the world, is policy and really getting access to the healthcare systems in order to ensure. So if we just donated money to individuals to pay for their drug, for example, we could treat 10 patients around the world and then we'd be out of money, or 50 patients around the world. That doesn't help the 500,000, right? So a gene therapy just recently got approved for $2.8 million. Well, how much money, even Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, for example, has $5 billion. They don't pay for drugs for individuals with cystic fibrosis because they can't treat them all. And then how do you prioritize who gets it, right? So ultimately, having very strong investment into policy, supporting the countries to ensure that we understand the economic burden of the disease. What does it cost to live with Angelman syndrome? And having a very strong story of how do you as anybody justify the price? And then working with the pharmaceutical companies, with the payers, and with the regulators to understand, is there economic value there? And again, we need to get drugs that work and approved, but while we're working through and pushing things through the drug development process, we're actively ensuring we understand what it costs to live with this disease so that there is justification for insurance companies to pay for it. And most pharmaceutical companies have incredible programs in order to help people pay for drugs within their own system. And, we are very closely tied with all of the different pharmaceutical companies to ensure that patients don't get left behind. But unfortunately, the patients can't drive the cost, but we can certainly drive the understanding of the alternative to the drug, of what does it cost to live with this disease, to really bring it forward and be at the forefront of the payers, which is insurance companies, healthcare systems, and making sure that they understand it's appropriately priced and they will pay for it. Because in the US, at least Medicaid is the main payer for rare disease. In the UK, it's going to be the national healthcare system. And so every program is going to have a different approach on how they're going to ensure it gets paid for. But there are some global communities where it's really hard. And we're going to have to go in there and we're going to have to ensure that we can't just pay for 1 or 5 patients to get a drug. What about the other 100? So we need to make sure that we are advocating for every patient in those communities.
And are you working with other disorder organizations because this is obviously going to be a common issue for like any rare disorder? Where you're looking at genetics. So are you working with them? Is there like some form of consortium for this?
That's a great idea. There's not exactly a consortium, but we our biggest advisors are the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, who with Vertex have done this time and time again, and they've really made drug access through policy and and understanding economic burden very available. And so they have been guiding us incredibly of all the groundwork we need to lay out right now, early on, before an approval, in order to make sure when we get there that we have everything ready. Newborn screening, I mean, all of that. I think that there's also Cure, SMA, so spinal muscular atrophy, so Cure SMA, they have gone through this process with Spinraza and Zolgensma now. And so really understanding what they did and guiding the process that they took, we're using that as a roadmap as well. But there is not a consortium. And I think as more and more drugs get on the market, it's going to become more and more obvious the need for prices to be appropriate for people to be able to pay for them.
Sorry, I just want to follow on, Alison. With regards to the cost, and obviously when you're talking to health services, so in Ireland, is there a disease burden or a cost of disease burden evaluation for Angelman syndrome done over the course of the lifespan? Because our children will live for quite a long time. And has that research been done?
That's being done right now. So they just did a really good one with Zynteglo that just got approved for beta thalassemia. And they showed that the cost of living with beta thalassemia was like over $6.8 million or $6.5 million or something like that. And they priced this drug at $2.8 million. And they felt that that was justifiable because the cost without it is more than the cost with it. We're doing that work right now. It's very expensive because you have to dive into not just what does it cost, until age 18, but what does it cost when the parents are gone and the burden it takes on a caregiver or a community, a community environment in which that adult is going to be living when they don't have a caretaker. What cost is that on the system? And then what are they losing? Right? What are they not contributing to society because they're not working? And so we're working through all of those details. One of our board members, actually, Lauren Hoffer, with an entire team, is working really hard on this economic burden. And it's, millions and millions and millions of dollars. And certainly we're working through over the lifetime, not just, most of them are only over 18 years or only over rare disease, period, not this rare disease. We're working on this rare disease. What does Angelman syndrome cost? And we're doing that, certainly in the United States, with a model to then take that to other countries to just fill in the blanks of what does this cost in your country? And then we can do that matrix for different environments where the cost is going to be a bit different.
Could I ask, would you start with a condition, like when you're making an estimation like that, would there not already be kind of similar conditions or similar sort of places to start with, or do you have to be specific for every type of condition already?
You have to be pretty specific. So there are some generalities, like there is a cost of living estimate for just rare disease by the Every Life Foundation in this cost burden. But really, if you think of the average rare disease, you really are not accounting for the more severe rare diseases in that many rare diseases, you can still live an independent life. You're just on medications and you're needing to live. That could be, dwarfism.
Yeah.
And you can't compare that to what it costs for Angelman. So there is not anything specifically like Angelman that's non-degenerative, that's severely developmental, that will live a relatively normal length of life in a full care environment. There's really nothing established like that. Now, Some other degenerative diseases have done it, but we can't exactly compare to them because we have a different trajectory.
Okay.
Alison, thank you so much. Thank you for a lot of things, and thank you for this presentation. So just, I'm asking you for a comment, which is also, I believe, can be useful for the people that are following us also in the live stream. So, you know, different levels. It's a complicated path to get there, and there are really different levels. We're now talking about, you know, the financial and economic implications, which is highly important. But before getting there, we need something that has to go on the market, so it's research. But all those levels, you see, it's always, you know, talking about the pharmaceutical industry. We need to work with them. We need to collaborate with them. So how, and I think it is important to comment on this, how it has been so far, the relationship with the pharmaceutical industry at different levels, including research, and how do you think, and how much do you think is actually real, this wind of change of patient centricity is really there in the pharma industry? Are we really leading a new era where this patient centricity is more really there? If that is a reality, and pharma industry finally understood that it's the time for, developing drugs with the patients rather than for the patients.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think it's really hard to answer. So I've been around long enough to see the first pharma enter the space to now the 30-something. And what I can tell you is that I think the intention of pharma to want to understand the patient experience and to work with what is important and meaningful to patients and families is real. I think they want it. What I think is impossible is that they can't live it. And so on face, what reads well and the lip service of what they're trying to produce is right. And I believe they really, really want it. Some of these pharmas are so big that what is meaningful to the families that the research team knows and sees doesn't make its way up within the chain of the company for decisions to be made that just might not be in the best interest of the community. And I think that that's just the nature of large companies. When you have smaller biotechs, I think it's very different. When you have big companies, I think that that's honest. And it's expected, right? Because some of them are just well bigger than rare. And they're trying to do rare, but they always answer to these huge shareholders that are not engaging in this experience. So I think that the intention's really good. I think some pharmas do an awesome job. I think others don't. They do a less good job. Even though they put it on their website for sure that they do it. But I think they want to. I think they mean to. I think that they have patient advocacy groups, right, that come out and talk to us. But how much of that is actually heard by the CEO and the board of directors? I don't know. And when you see some decisions being made, programs being pulled, really not doing the right thing by the patient groups and holding on to things, pausing things, shelving things when the patient groups want them to be advanced, well, you know, that's business. Business is going to drive it because they can't keep their doors open without money. And so I think it's a conflict at times because you can't always meet what the families want or what the patients want, even though their intentions are to do so. So I don't think it's a lack of trying, and I don't think it's a lack of earnest, like they really want to do it. I think that it just becomes bigger than them. I think some of the smaller biotechs, it's much more palpable. And I do believe some of the bigger companies now are doing an awesome job. But the real big ones, I think it's a little harder.
Thank you, Alison. The other point that's exciting, and maybe the families from Ireland in here can actually comment on that. You know, at the very beginning of your talk, when you were talking about your experience as a mother, that got a diagnosis for her kid and had to go on Google this. We heard that from, you know, other mothers, Critical 5, Fragile X. It's always the same story. can I tell you that, even if, I'm not impacted, my life is not impacted by rare disease, but I do find this comment every time, and it's always at the beginning, terrifying. Terrifying. It's really terrifying. I mean, what can we do? What do you think? What do you think can be done to increase awareness of, doctors of rare diseases, so that because some of the family we interact in Ireland, I mean, they were told by the doctors, go and Google your disease so that you can discover what it is. How painful this is. What can we do to change this? I mean, we would like to help. We are already trying to do it with some diseases like CDKL5, but again, I think it's really terrifying.
Yeah, we talk a lot about this in the community of that no one should have the experience we had in this day and age. And then you see someone who was just diagnosed last week and basically was told, take your child home and love them. But in the same respect, I got a call maybe a month ago from a parent who they were in the geneticist's office. They got their diagnosis. Their son was 20 months old. And what this woman did, and now she's an incredible geneticist, very, well known, but what she did was she said, she called them and said, your son has been diagnosed. What she said was, I have incredible news for you. Your son has been diagnosed with a rare disease called Angelman Syndrome. And there is so much research in this rare disease that if he was to have one single rare disease, you are so lucky. Because I make this phone call every day, and I can never tell parents that they can contact FAST and they will have a completely changed life for their child. She told this family that. That's how they got their diagnosis. So I think our story will be told, and geneticists and neurologists that are making these diagnoses will hopefully be able to say, I can never give you good news, but today I can. And the family came to us with I am so grateful that this is the rare disease my kid has, because at 20 months they knew something was seriously wrong. They're so glad it was this, where I was the opposite. I was like, what is that? I don't know what this is, and this is terrible, and there's no hope. And she was the first word she was given was I have really good news for you. That this is going to be cured in your child's lifetime. And you are entering in a really good phase where, it's now finally okay for a human to be diagnosed with Angelman syndrome. It wasn't when many of our kids were diagnosed. So hopefully press and knowledge and education, but our clinicians speak at the Rare Pediatric Neurology Conference, AES, the genetic conferences, just being at ASGCT and being at all these different conferences where clinicians attend to hear the Angelman story, I think gives them the idea that what's Angelman syndrome? Oh, that's the disease where they have a lot of people working on it. Let me look and see. Where when my daughter was diagnosed, I think the geneticist looked it up. He actually handed me a pile of papers that said Prader-Willi syndrome. And I was like, and that's not what she has. I'm a mother and I could tell you that's not, I had to tell him, the geneticist, that that's not what she has. I had to say, can you do a methylation test? It's a different era, I think. So I'm hoping time, education, going out there and, giving information to neurologists and geneticists, because that's generally, at least in most of the world, I think where the diagnosis comes from.
Just to add on to that, I think educating our student healthcare professionals about these diseases and letting them have experiences like talks from our spouse and our other parents that are living this life. I mean, we can't bring them home with us to live our lives so that they can see what it's like 24/7. It's intense. But I think going in, my background is as a physiotherapist. So when I was in college, we would have had patients come in and talk to us about their Parkinson's disease. Those are the talks that resonated with me as a student, and I think that's something that we need to focus more on. In addition to all this other work that's going on, I think that's our young healthcare professionals of the future. They need to know these stories and be us living them.
I think that's a really good point, and I'd actually put it out beyond even the healthcare students towards psychology. I don't know if that falls into healthcare, but it's kind of a dual academic healthcare profession and the basic scientists. Because I work on Fragile X, but before I started working on Fragile X, my understanding of Fragile X was you opened a textbook and it said Fragile X is an example of an X inherited disease. Oh, that's it. And nothing else. And like all the nuance with it and the impact it can have on a life, not just on the person affected, but the people around them, the community around them. And I think you talk to some researchers who have this in their life and you see the difference in how they approach it. And I think that's what we need to get across. Like, I mean, how many people in TVSI here working on something like Alzheimer's disease actually walk into a care home and say, I'd like to hear your story, or I'd like to talk to your family? Like, it doesn't happen. Like, I mean, it's like they go in and talk to their mice. And as you say, it's great to be an Alzheimer's mouse or an Angelman's mouse, because yeah, okay, they can check it out, they can do stuff that works, but we need to get it into people and we need to have that drive there. And I think we need to get it in from at all levels, not just delivering the news, but it's kind of depressing me that we're not seeing more researchers here right now. Like, I mean, we have our team, but like, I mean, where's everyone else? Why aren't they attending these? But they'll go to something where it's like, oh, well, this might be good because they published in Nature and they did whatever kind of thing. But like, what's that? Like, honestly.
Yeah, it's a leap. And, you know, we're really lucky, at least our research teams around the world come to the family conferences and they talk to parents and they engage and they cry and they hug and they paddle race for $10,000 because they want to help cure Angelman syndrome too. Like, you see the impact that we as parent advocates have on the research team and the tears in their eyes and the joy and the excitement. I remember when, you know, the first, you know, clinical data came out on, you know, one of the programs that was positive, and another researcher who was frankly like in competition with the researcher whose program got taken by pharma was like, I am so proud that I'm going to live to see the transformation in these kids, whether it's me that discovered it or not. I'm going to live to see it, and to see the humility of our teams. Hopefully more and more scientists will experience that if they work on some of these diseases. And I encourage them all to go to the family scientific conferences where they can actually talk to those impacted, because it's just a different perspective, for sure.
I mean, if I can give you my experience, you know, well, first of all, we will try. I mean, you know, fail again and fail better. You know, that was Samuel Becker. So we're going to insist with this. We're going to try to have this room with more researchers. And, you know, my own experience and my turning point has been 3 years ago. My first family awareness day with the CDKL5 deficiency disorder community. It was just like, no, it was conversion or an alignment. I just realized, what have I done all those past 18, 17 years of research? What have I done? And I was thinking like, okay, I've been closed in a lab, fancying to publish in Nature. And I am the guinea pig. You know, I'm just out of reality completely. That's you know, how I'm actually helping really. And I remember, you know, when I studied veterinary medicine, when I then became a neuropsychopharmacologist, I thought that I have a mission, and my mission is not to publish in fancy journals, and my mission is to help the others, you know. And that's probably where we have to go, trying to push a little bit, find a compromise, you know, that researchers can understand.
Yeah.
And you can actually help a lot of people by publishing in Nature. Like, you could do both.
You can absolutely, yeah. You can actually do both, but you know,
just work on the things that are meaningful to families and the
Exactly. So you can have even more meaningful papers on Nature if you talk with Nature. So that's probably the good message.
Meaningful on multiple levels. Okay, I think possibly at that point we've had a lot of questions. So I think it's time for let you have a rest and a cup of tea.
I have a question.
Oh, sorry.
I'm fine.
Also, the questions from the students if we have it, we need to check.
So you go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for this talk. It was very inspiring, especially I'm a neurologist from Egypt. It's a different part of the world where we have these resources and we need more work on changing the mindset, not only among the community, but even among the people who are responsible for this mindset, the neurologists, the psychiatrists, and people working with the diseases themselves. Because when we are talking about a rare disease in a country like my country, the answer is it's just a rare disease. Why shall we do so and so for a rare disease? And we are overwhelmed with other diseases, non-communicable diseases, hypertension, diabetes, and infectious diseases as well. So how can we face this challenge of having a rare disease that needs a lot of work, starting from the diagnosis, because we don't have the infrastructure for diagnosis like good genetic testing, good geneticists, or equipment even, and how to spread awareness about the disease and to establish supporting groups and people in the community who can help each other and to have good access to care in different levels, like the speech therapy, physiotherapy, psychotherapy, and occupational therapy. We don't have all of these things together, and we used to create in these silos that you mentioned, but it's not about the collaboration between the basic scientists and the clinician. It's about the clinicians themselves, and we don't talk to each other, and we don't have these communities that can support people with their disease. So how can we begin? How can we do something for these people, like people with Angelman Syndrome, or people like Huntington's disease, where I really like and interested in, and trying to find a way for this patient with Huntington's disease. So what's your comment on that?
If I can solve that problem, then I'd get a Nobel Prize. But it's a hard situation that I don't have the answer for. But what I would say is that I do feel it's bigger than rare disease. It's a social responsibility to care for humans. Whether it's a common disease or a rare disease, caring for a human should be agnostic to their disease. And bringing a community to all humans, whether it's rare or not rare, is like a human right to have companionship and to have a community of people that understand what you're going through. And so I think a lot of people chalk it up as like, well, we don't have a lot of funding, so we're going to focus on the big things, not the little things. But the things that you can do are, for rare diseases, making sure that there are communities that can come together to support each other, communities that can raise their own funds in order to do some of the work. I think leaving them out and not allowing for awareness and support efforts, whether it's physical therapy, occupational therapy, whatever it is, I think it's a human right for a community to be responsible for everyone within that community, regardless of their disease. And so rare is one of them, but so is hypertension and so is diabetes. But I don't think somebody with diabetes should have a priority over somebody with a rare disease if we have social responsibility of that we're all human and we all are diverse and have different problems. You may not be able to solve the problem with a gene therapy, but you can solve the problem with creating a community. Because socially, that is one of the most important things for a family and for a patient, is having a community. And that doesn't cost money, that's time, right? So you got to start with community, and then the power of that community will grow, and they will advocate for themselves, which will help other people around them that are professional advocate for them. I think that would be where I would find, if I were in that circumstance, the most important thing for me. It was finding our community was everything for me from an emotional perspective.
I think we all agree actually with that, Alison. I don't think we could have gotten through the last 5 years without the community that we've had in syndrome, because nobody can understand the journey that you're on. It's that shared lived experience of peer-to-peer support and lived experience. It's incredibly powerful for families, and it helps you put that foot in front, one foot in front of the other, and just keep going, even when you don't think you have it in it. So,
and that doesn't cost anything, right?
Yeah.
That's just social responsibility to create community. Maybe? Did that answer?
I'm trying to do this, but let's see.
You need to speak to your fellow, neurologists to explain why you think this is so important, maybe, and get their support to do it.
Yes, I tried, and I started to collaborate with international figures and trying to do educational courses explaining the disease in depth and why it is important to know about the disease and to diagnose the disease and everything. But unfortunately, no one is interested. We only have 50, 60 participants from, 2,000 neurologists or something. So it's
I have a suggestion. Don't ask the neurologists, ask the mothers. Yeah. You get a bunch of us mothers into the room, we'll change the world for our children. Those are the people you want fighting your corner for you.
yes,
They're
and
the people that
fortunately
we
from the attendees, there were many caregivers, yes, and it was open for the scientists and for the public to attend. And yes, you are right. People affected by the disease, people impacted by the disease are more keen to know about the disease.
But I think that those are the communities that drive progress.
Yeah.
Everything there was driven by moms and dads and grandparents.
And I think the other thing that is important is, for example, I am from Colombia, and I think sometimes you are able to just use your language to go into them. Like, for example, in Colombia, it is a lot of families that know they have it, but they are not even able to go and listen to another's mother because everyone speaks English. And for example, in Colombia, we don't speak English. So sometimes, like when you communicate with them and they hear you talking about that in the language, they feel, oh my God, it's someone that knows, someone that can communicate with me, someone that relies on me and understand how the things work here. How is difficult go to the doctor, how is difficult that, is even the social thing. And sometimes, for example, with families, when the kid has some kind of developmental problem, it's a rejection sometimes for the family from the society. It is not an easy way. Like, for example, I am here and I say, some people is lucky here. In Colombia, we don't have even a way to get our kids into the buses or to cross the street because we don't have that. And sometimes it sounds like a little, but when you just call them and say, look, I am doing this podcast and I'm going to join and you can't imagine the happiness in that moment, how they start saying to you, thank you. And in some way, when they say to you, thank you because you're doing science and you made many sacrifices, but we thank you because I know that is going to make the difference for us. So I think even if it is small, you can't imagine how much means for them, and especially in countries like ours. Yeah.
Actually, talking about languages, we had a comment on the live stream now that people were watching at you, Alice, and there was one comment was, do we have subtitles in Spanish? That's how important it is. And
I speak New York fast, so.
Can I add a troublemaker comment? Because I'm a troublemaker. And I was thinking about what you said about the involvement of pharmaceutical, and some of them pay lip service, and they might want to do a lot, but then their programs are shut down. I think maybe we could start with the bare minimum. If all pharma has programs for marketing their pharmaceuticals, right? How about they put some of that money and that effort into marketing information and awareness, and just they get to the doctors anyway. They have medical representatives. If you're working on a disease, on a disorder, or if you're working in the context of that disease, you print out leaflets as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of marketing and lots of patient advocacy folks and medical affairs, but usually you don't make it to that level until you have a drug in the clinic or a drug that has enough promise that is going through the regulatory authorities. They don't put that money or effort. There's a hierarchy of when you approach, when a disease gets to that level, no one does that really until they don't want to put that money in until they have something that they can promise they're going to deliver upon. And
that's why I was saying, as a troublemaker, instead of just marketing their own product, just saying, okay, maybe we're going to start working into this at a base science level, so it's not a drug yet, but we're still just going to contact the clinicians that we want to collaborate with afterwards for clinical trials, and just give them little leaflets, and we're just going to tell them, this is information about Angelman that you can give to your patients with a link to FAST. Not just for themselves, not just for their own drugs.
You can try that.
Oh yeah, very well. That's why I say I'm a troublemaker.
Okay, I think at this point we all need a cup of tea or coffee.
Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you for the questions and the great discussion. And thank you, Alison, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.